Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Michael Gershuni. I'm the Director of Counseling and Mental Health at Jewish Family Services. For those of you who are not aware of Jewish Family Services, Jewish Family Services of Ottawa is a not-for-profit here in Ottawa. We serve the capital region and work around the Eastern Ontario region. Here today we are working through our program called the Counseling Group, which offers the counseling on a sliding scale basis to the white community. We work in 14 languages and offer our services to adult children, youth, families, couples, ages 6 and up, as well as different groups. We would love to talk to you more in the future if you have any more interests. We are very happy to have you today, Anne Vallely and Monica Williams. Dr. Anne Vallely is a professor for classics and religion studies in the University of Ottawa, as well as the director of psychedelics and spirituality program. And Dr. Monica Williams is a professor in the School of Psychology, as well as the research chair for mental health and disparities in the University of Ottawa. They both have created Canada's first graduate program in psychedelic studies in 2020, and now hope to be the first university to launch a master's degree in psychedelic studies in the fall of 2023. So we really have two experts in the field, in this really promising field. And I'll give the stage now to Anne and Monica. What we're going to do, we're going to have the presentation for about an hour. Sorry, Anne and Monica, just before maybe one more thing. And we'll keep half an hour at the end for questions. So we're not losing kind of the line of thread. There's a lot of material to cover. Depending on the interest, we might have some follow-ups and offer some additional presentations on the subject as well. If you're not muted, please mute yourself so it just doesn't create disturbances to the rest of us. Thank you very much. And Monica, please, the stage is yours.
I'll take it over for the first couple of minutes. So first of all, thank you very much for having us here today. I want to thank the Jewish Family Services and the Counseling Group, Michael Gershuni in particular, for having the vision that this might be an interesting topic for counselors in not just in Ottawa, right? We're probably reaching beyond Ottawa as well. And Tatiana, thank you so much for your help. There's a lot of back and forth in making this happen. So really delighted to be here. And I'm going to jump right in. We were saying that we would keep the questions to the end. Of course, my thing is not working now. Just 2 secs. No, okay, I'll have to do it by another way. But if there's a question of clarification, if there's really something that's, we've said a term or went too quickly, then don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask the question. But if it's a question that's going to take more time to respond, then let's save those to the end, because as Michael was saying, there's a fair bit of content actually in this presentation. So what we're hoping to get through, discuss with you about for the next hour is an overview of this emerging field of psychedelic medicine. We're going to look at the specific substances. We want to look at the current research and therapy around psychedelic medicines. We're also going to talk about non-ordinary states of consciousness, transcendence, and spirituality, as well as the importance of training and opportunities then for counselors and therapists. So kind of redundant time here, but here's my photo. And Michael has also nicely introduced us. But again, my name is Anne Vallely, and I am in classics and religious studies, University of Ottawa. My background is in anthropology. So I'm an anthropologist of religion. I do most of my work in India, but I'm interested in comparative religion, comparative mysticism. I'm also very much interested in end-of-life studies or issues, contemplative practices, healing, and of course, psychedelic-assisted therapies as well. So I'm actually going to stop talking right now, and I'll come back in a few slides, but just to hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Monica Williams.
Yes, hello, and it's wonderful to be here. Like Dr. Vallely, I am also part of the faculty at the University of Ottawa. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Mental Health Disparities, so I'm very interested in equal and equitable access to mental health, particularly some of these new emerging mental health modalities like psychedelics, and also, the impact of racism and discrimination on marginalized communities. I am a clinical psychologist, so I'm also licensed in the United States and registered here in Canada as well. And I'm primarily a researcher, although I do a little bit of everything. So, all right. So let's move on and talk a little bit about what are psychedelics. So we can define these as a class of psychoactive substances. So they work in the brain that produce what we refer to as non-ordinary states of consciousness through changes in perception, mood, and cognitive processes. Now, some people might call these like altered states of consciousness. We prefer the term non-ordinary states of consciousness because I think the term altered states kind of has a lot of baggage and maybe implies an undesirable state of consciousness, whereas for doing psychedelic psychotherapy, these non-ordinary states of consciousness are very deliberate and intentional. And then here we have, and so there are several different types of psychedelics. So we could go on to the next slide and I can show you a few of these. These are the ones that are really sort of the most popular, the most researched and studied. These are not, by all means, not all different psychedelics, but probably most of you have heard of LSD, which is, a synthetic chemical. Actually, it's derived from a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. And then also psilocybin is sort of considered as classic psychedelic. It comes from certain types of mushrooms, and these mushrooms are all over the world in every continent. Peyote, this is contains mescaline, which is a psychedelic substance. It's a cactus that is used by the Native American Church for their ceremonies. And DMT is a chemical that is also psychedelic, causes a very intense experience. It's found in some Amazonian plants like ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a tea that's made from plants and the DMT is in it. Also, people actually have a little bit of natural DMT in their bodies already. And this other substance, MDMA, may be sometimes referred to as an enactogen. It promotes feelings of connection and openness. It's sometimes referred to as ecstasy or Molly. Although, anything you get on the street, you don't really know what's in it. So we prefer to say MDMA because we know that that's actually pure MDMA. And then other types of psychedelics include some that are referred to as dissociative hallucinogens, such as ketamine. Ketamine, unlike the other substances, is legal, and it's actually been used for decades for surgery. It's very safe. They use it in children, also used in animals. Salvia is a plant in southern Mexico and Central and South America that's also in this category, as well as ibogaine, which is comes from the root bark of the iboga tree in Africa, and it's being used and studied for treating addiction. And then there's and then when we talk about psychedelics, there's a class of psychedelics that we may refer to as entheogens. These are just generally like natural stuff that grows out of the earth that has psychedelics in it, but isn't like, necessarily made in a lab. So that's a distinction some people make. Now, contrary to what you might believe, actually psychedelic research is not new. LSD and other psychedelic drugs were once used experimentally and clinically in psychiatry for a very long time. And it wasn't even just a fad. Actually, there were more than 1,000 clinical papers that discussed over 40,000 patients. There were several dozen books, 6 international conferences on psychedelic drug therapy. And a lot of that research happened right here in Canada. And so psychedelics were around for a long time before they sort of fell out of favor, out of fashion in the 70s with the war on drugs. They were, it was determined, or it was decided rather, that these drugs had no medicinal or therapeutic value, and so they were made illegal. And so now we are starting to see a resurgence in interest in psychedelics. You can go to the next slide. And so for example, Johns Hopkins has been like really kind of one of the leaders in terms of doing psychedelic research. They got a $17 million grant to open up a new psychedelic center recently. Yale has a psychedelic science group. They're opening a new center. University of Toronto has a laboratory for psychedelic studies and research. And also, you know, the University Health Network has got a big grant for psychedelic research and training. Imperial College of London has been doing this work for a while, and UC Berkeley has a new center for psychedelics. And that's not all. Next slide, please. You can see that there are many other places. I mean, the psychedelic centers, they're sprouting out like mushrooms in a rainstorm, and they're all over the place. And so, and in fact, the University of Wisconsin now has a master's degree in psychoactive substances, which is really specializing in psychedelics. So, so a lot of top universities are having centers and initiatives to really study these substances and train people in them. You know, and so this is like a real thing. And next slide. And psychedelics have psychedelic therapies have arrived, even though these substances are still not legal and hard to get. Psychedelic therapy is actually already happening here in Canada. We have research that's going on. In fact, the you know, the CIHR just recently had a call for research for proposals, for grant proposals to study psilocybin for end of life, for depression, and for substance use. And that was the first time the federal government has actually stepped out and said, hey, we want to pay for this research. And in fact, you can get people who have end of life distress and other life-threatening conditions can actually petition and get a special exemption to use psychedelics for those conditions. And believe it or not, Alberta recently legalized psychedelic psychotherapy. I gotta admit, I did not see that one coming, but that's going to be rolling out in January. So who knew, right? So they're here, and they're going to become legal eventually. Probably in the next few years, we're going to see them become legal in the States, and shortly thereafter here in Canada as well. Probably psilocybin here first, and then MDMA, probably the reverse in the States is what we're predicting. So. So there's been a lot of questions about psychedelics, a lot of speculation. You know, how do we move these substances, which have been around for, you know, thousands of years, into Western medicine, and that's something we're all still trying to figure out. What's the best way to do that? Next slide. One way that people, one thing that's gotten really popular is what people call microdosing, and this is the practice of taking very small doses of a psychedelic substance every day. If you go online, there's lots of people talking about the benefits of this. Lots of wealthy billionaires in Silicon Valley swear it makes them more creative. We actually don't have any research yet on if microdosing works, but there's a certain appeal of it. And I think part of that is because of our own conditioning around mental health medications, the idea that you would take a pill every day. So of course, wouldn't you take a psychedelic every day if that makes you better? But really, what I think and what's so attractive to me about psychedelic psychotherapy is that the idea isn't that you keep taking it. The idea is that you take it a few times and then you get well, and then you move on, and you don't need to keep taking it. So, so there's lots of different opinions about microdosing, and I think, you know, the research is starting, and maybe we'll have some answers around that soon. All right, next slide. I also mentioned that ketamine was already legal. It had been used as an anesthetic, and then there had been some research showing that it was extremely effective for people with severe depression. And in fact, new research shows that it's actually a wonderful way to prevent suicide in people who are at risk. And so in the US, lots and lots of ketamine infusion centers have opened up where people just get ketamine, they put it straight in your veins, you know, you go to the infusion center, you lay there, you get your ketamine, and then you go home and you feel better for a while, and then you come back in a few weeks and get more ketamine. And some of those are opening here too. And then also now now there's an actual medication that you spray in your nose called esketamine. And it's really like just ketamine. I don't want to go into details about the chemical differences, but it's really just ketamine that you spray up your nose, and it's supposed to also help people with depression. Now, again, it's sort of in that same format where you take a little bit every day, which to me is really kind of not the promise of psychedelics. That is not the reason I'm here. I'll tell you that much, because again, it's just treating the symptoms and not providing a cure. All right, next slide. And then finally, we have, I touched on how psychedelics have been used for end-of-life distress. We have some really great research that's come out about this. And there's been a big push here in Canada for people to have the right to try these psychedelic substances to deal with end-of-life distress. Because considering that people here have the right to die, advocates are saying, well, shouldn't you have the right to try? Shouldn't you have the right to try something that might ease your distress and create a more meaningful, peaceful departure for yourself and your family? And people have been listening, and the government's been listening. And so so this is becoming increasingly studied. And I think it's going to be a really important application of psychedelics, this end of life distress. And we'll talk a little more about that later. And next slide. And then also we have, I mentioned MDMA. MDMA is being studied specifically for PTSD. And already the clinical trials for this are, fantastic. Phase 3 study. One phase 3 study has already been published. Another one is going to be coming out very soon from MAPS, which has been sponsoring this MDMA research for the last couple decades, actually, in an attempt to have MDMA be available as a medicine. And MDMA actually used to be used in therapy quite often. It was called ADAM. It was used back like in the 80s to help facilitate the therapeutic process. And there were actually a lot of mental health professionals who were very upset when this was made illegal, because they had been using it successfully for some time. Because one of the ways MDMA works is it helps to reduce feelings of fear and increase feelings of trust and of love and of connection. And these properties, really make it, I mean, some people say kind of an ideal like therapy psychedelic, especially if you're working with trauma, which can be so hard for people to approach. And I was trained in prolonged exposure, actually trained by Edna Foa in prolonged exposure. So I'm like huge into that, but because it's just incredibly effective. But the fact of the matter is, like, patients don't want to do it, and the therapists, most of them don't want to give it because it's a really hard therapy. And so one of the things that attracted me to the MDMA research was just seeing how effective it is in such a, well, I would think, more humane way. And the results that are coming out are really just as good as what we've seen with exposure-based therapies like prolonged exposure. So this is actually already rolling out in the States in a form called expanded access, which is basically like compassionate use, where people are allowed to use it while because it seems promising, and the research is kind of happening that's very positive. So MDMA, in MDMA research studies, the MDMA is only taken 2 to 3 times in conjunction with the therapy. Therapy is a very important piece of this. It's not just like you take MDMA and you're cured of your trauma. Otherwise everyone who went to a rave would be cured of their traumas, but we know that doesn't happen. So we think the therapy is important. All right, next slide. And then also we have what's called ayahuasca for mental health. There's been a huge surge in research in ayahuasca. It has not been as popular to research because a lot of people get very nauseous and throw up, and that kind of create some, I don't know, complications for research studies. So there's been less interest in studying that, but there's been a lot of research on it in South America. And there's, again, over 100 peer-reviewed articles exploring ayahuasca for eating disorders and substance use disorders and PTSD and depression. And so ayahuasca is also, another one to watch. Research shows that it stimulates neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, creative thinking, while at the same time decreasing conventional convergent thinking. So it allows people to think about things differently. And I think it's probably true of all psychedelics, actually. They call it the brutal mirror. The experiences people have with ayahuasca, sometimes they can take a good hard look at themselves in a way they hadn't been able to before. So that's why this one particular person called it the brutal mirror. And next slide. And then finally, so ayahuasca is also illegal, except it is legal in special, if you have a religious exemption, like in some ayahuasca churches. But for the most part, people are going overseas to get ayahuasca. And a number of veterans now are regularly going overseas to get ayahuasca for their PTSD. And this one organization called Heroic Hearts, the Heroic Hearts Project is part of Healing Hearts. They raise money and they send 2 to 5 veterans to centers in Latin America fairly regularly to get healing. And there's actually a video you can watch if you're interested to learn more about it. This is a picture of an former Army Ranger medic who is getting ayahuasca therapy to help him move past his traumas. And I'll hand the baton back to Anne now.
Thank you, Monica. Okay. All right. What about spirituality, right? What is this connection between psychedelics and spirituality that we hear an awful lot about? And indeed, one of the most extraordinary aspects of these substances is their ability to catalyze transpersonal experiences. These experiences that are often experiences of a deep spiritual nature. And in fact, it's this factor that justifies my involvement in their study. And it's also this factor which makes the involvement of counselors and spiritual care professionals so urgent, so important. To the next slide. And I'm just trying to toggle between 2 documents here. To look at the historical use. So I'm asking, what's this connection between psychedelics and spirituality? It's a very ancient connection. It's a deep-rooted connection. And if we look in the history of the association of the use of psychedelics, we see that the use of these sacred plants or psychedelics among indigenous communities, both indigenous and non-indigenous, in fact, communities, were invariably used as sacred plants in the context of spirituality. This is the term entheogen, which Monica has already mentioned, applies here. So entheogen is a neologism that means, it comes from the Greek, and it effectively means creating the divine within or experiencing the divine within. And contemporary indigenous use as well would be entheogenic. Right? Psychedelics are used sacramentally within indigenous communities. There's something about these substances, about these plants and fungi, that catalyze a transpersonal experience. And one, as I'm saying, that's often experienced as deeply spiritual. So it's something far deeper than a hallucinogenic state. The relationship of psychedelics and spirituality within the context of healing may not be that surprising, right? That since healing, like illness itself, has had for most of humanity been understood to include a spiritual dimension. So whether it's sin or sinful thoughts or breaking of taboos, continues to be understood, certainly was in the past and continues amongst many communities to be understood as a factor in illness. Traditionally, the search for the cause, that etiology of the disease, would not have been content to just look at the individual physical body, right? It went beyond that to the group, the community, but also beyond that to metaphysical sources, right? Again, whether it's God, whether it's a sin against God, or it's karma, some sort of metaphysical dimension. So the connection between illness and healing and spirituality, of course, is very, very ancient. Modern Western societies have been really the aberration here in setting aside, if not dismissing, psychospiritual causes of illness, as well as psychospiritual cures. Right? Although there's been a greater interest in recent years in the role of spirituality in healing. We talk now about spiritual interventions. They're recognized as important, although certainly that the framing of these would be different. Their truth value, their veracity would be different than in traditional understandings, but nevertheless, the importance is being recognized. Let's see if I can get on to the next slide. Yeah. Even outside of their specific uses in healing, though, psychedelics have been used widely, traditionally, very, very widely. They were used for sources of knowledge. So looking for insight, for wisdom. They were used in rites of passage to foster connections within the community, to foster connections with the natural world. And all of these reasons for using psychedelics involved some kind of transpersonal dimension, some kind of non-ordinary state of consciousness. Again, a non-ordinary state of consciousness would be one that lies outside of the rational, the pragmatic, the logical mind, but it's understood to be a source of knowledge. So psychedelic plants were typically used in conjunction with other practices as well, prayer and fasting, dancing, drumming, and so on, as a subset, often as a subset of a broader set of techniques for non-ordinary states of consciousness. I have here a slide with a number of different religious traditions. Most, if not all human communities, most, if not all religious traditions have used techniques within the context of ceremony to alter consciousness. There are theorists who argue that the origin of religion, in fact, lies here in this transpersonal experience, the experience of the self beyond the small self, right? Beyond the small ego, and a connection with something greater. And that what we have today with religion is the institutionalization in some way of those memories or of those experiences. I mean, there's certainly arguments to that effect. There's certainly some connection, right, between religious traditions and non-ordinary states of consciousness or mystical states. Okay. All right. So clearly, psychedelics behave in ways that other drugs do not. And I'm saying other drugs that we could problematize whether or not psychedelics should be understood as drugs at all, but they typically are today in the current environment. So I'm using that language, but they certainly behave in ways other than the average, the typical pharmaceutical, unlike pharmaceuticals, which produce their desired effect in the absence of any subjective experience, right? We don't have to have a subjective experience when we take an antibiotic or an aspirin. Psychedelics heal by contrast because of the subjective experience. And this again is why psychedelic therapy must be psychedelic assisted psychotherapy or psychedelic assisted spiritual care rather than pharmacotherapy. It requires the involvement of therapists. Curative effects appear to be the result of self-transcendent or transpersonal experiences that they catalyze, that these psychedelics catalyze. The spiritual experience appears again to be a vitally important determinant of therapeutic success. And this is new territory, certainly for neuroscience. Much psychedelic research continues to be narrowly focused on brain chemistry, where spiritual experiences are understood as epiphenomena of a more fundamental neuropharmacological process. And understandably, within clinical settings aimed, for instance, at alleviating major depressive disorder or at alleviating opioid addictions, spiritual experiences are studied as tools or as mediating factors, which given the right set and setting, like the right context, can stimulate a positive therapeutic outcome. The outcome, of course, being the alleviation of whatever the ailment might be. So here we have a slide of some leaders actually in the field of psychedelic medicine. We have Matthew Johnson and Roland Griffiths, professors of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. As I said, lead researchers in psychedelic studies. And they make this spirituality as mediating factor or spirituality as tool approach very explicit in their writing, in their research. Roland Griffiths acknowledges, and I'm quoting him, although modern medicine doesn't typically understand or consider spiritual or religious experiences as one of the tools in the arsenal against sickness, our findings suggest that these encounters often lead to improvements in mental health. Right? So this is hugely promising, these psychedelics that can lead to some kind of therapeutic outcome in terms of mental health. But it also raises really interesting questions, right, in terms of the spiritual experience itself being the mediating factor. Let me get to my slides, trying to do two things. Here we go, yeah. So the bulk of clinical and neuroscientific research is moving in the direction of magnifying subjective states through high dosage of, for instance, psilocybin or other psychedelics, with the goal of engineering life transformative mystical experiences. There's some pharmaceutical research. I mean, it's out there, and certainly the pharmaceutical industry would be very interested in this other kind of research that's trying to isolate this active agent and remove the experiential component. But that to date still is the sort of the smaller portion. The bulk of the research is moving in the opposite direction and trying to cultivate or catalyze powerful spiritual experiences. And individuals are claiming to have very powerful, transformative spiritual experiences. So what does one do with these, right, with these experiences? Participants in psychedelic trials regularly claim that their experiences surpass the ordinary world of sense experience and make possible a direct perception of spiritual realities. For many, it can often lead to a sudden openness to creative possibilities that were previously unavailable. For others, their experiences clash with their everyday materialist worldview, right, which declares these experiences to be impossible. Right? What are these experiences? For others, the experiences can be quite confusing and startling, and for some, they even talk about these experiences leading to a kind of ontological shock, right, and giving forth an entirely new worldview. All right. And I wanted to give you just one example of that. I always mentioned this particular participant that was in the Johns Hopkins psilocybin trial. She's wonderful, she's very articulate, and she really captures actually some of the fascinating questions that are emerging, at least as far as I'm concerned, from this field. So Rachel Peterson entered a clinical trial at the Johns Hopkins University where she was given high doses of psilocybin to treat a major depressive disorder that she suffered for most of her life. And in the end, she claims it was her worldview and not her depressive condition that was most affected by the experience. Although the experience did not cure her of her depression, she says that it kind of shrunk in its significance. And so she said it's not that my despair had diminished, the frame around it expanded. And in that vast, blessed, blank space, I find divine okayness. The sense of being held by a great, ineffable beyond makes it easier to hold my own suffering and others. And she says, at the peak of my experience, my sense of self dissolved and I was unified with an abiding force that permeated all existence, something that felt conscious, vast, benevolent, eternal, peaceful, and furiously important. After sitting up on the couch 6 hours later, covered in snot and tears, I struggled to put words to an encounter that felt more real than the everyday reality, a mind-bendy paradox characteristic of many mystical experiences. And there are a number of works out there, a fair bit of research that's comparing, and I'm very interested in this myself, in comparing traditional mystical accounts with psychedelic accounts of mysticism. I'm just highlighting one book called Sacred Knowledge by William Richards, who claims that there's a striking correspondence between classical mystical states and those that are catalyzed by psychedelics. This is debated. I mean, it's hotly debated. It's a fascinating discussion, but certainly many people are making that claim that Rachel Peterson was claiming herself. Others also are experiencing profoundly different understandings of the world around them, as though nature itself is purposeful, right? That nature itself is a teacher. And we have here a quote from an article by Laura Dev writing on Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous understandings of psychedelics, that the plants themselves are the teachers, right? So this, again, can lead for many to a kind of ontological shock, right? A radically different worldview. And I guess what I'm just suggesting here is that much of the research is being done within neuroscience and in clinical settings that may not be well disposed or capable of dealing with this kind of response. When you have a patient who's having this kind of experience, their depression has changed, their addiction has changed, it may have been healed, but they've also had a profoundly different experience. And one doesn't want that to be diminished. And that's, again, why I feel that it's very important to have counselors and spiritual care professionals being involved as psychedelic therapy is rolled out. Okay, yeah, it's just that, the last slide, really just to, my last slide for the moment, just sort of making a plea again, or a case for certain kinds of essential competencies that one would need if one is working with psychedelic therapies. There was an article in 2017 by Janice Phelps who outlined some of these core competencies, and I think there's a lot of overlap with the competencies that you're already seeing in counseling work, and it's certainly in chaplaincy, spiritual care work. Okay, I think at this point, Monica, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and I find that really the spiritual facet of this so fascinating. I love to hear Anne talk about this, because as a clinical psychologist, religious and spiritual facets were not ever a part of anything that I was taught. Even though we know that people's faith and religion is, in spiritual sense of spirituality, is so important to them. So, so as a researcher, this was always so very interesting to me, that the spiritual piece just keeps popping up as we're doing the psychedelic research. You really can't separate it, because it's always inserting itself. So next slide, please. Now, when we talk about psychedelic psychotherapies, one of the questions that always comes up is the safety, or rather the danger of psychedelics, the perception being that because these substances were scheduled or made illegal, therefore they must be very, very dangerous. But actually, this is not true. If you look at all of the different drugs that exert action on the central nervous system, psychedelics are among the safest classes of drugs, much more safe than things like even alcohol and tobacco and a lot of the stuff that people are getting from their psychiatrists. So, so the drugs are actually, physically speaking, pretty safe. Doesn't mean they're 100% safe, because I mean, no drug's 100% safe for everyone. But comparatively speaking, they're not dangerous, and most of these are not addictive either. Substances are addictive when people are, have an immediate positive experience. And one thing we know about psychedelics is psychedelic experiences are unpredictable, and sometimes they're fantastic, and sometimes they're pretty scary, and they take time to happen for the most part. And so they don't fit the profile of substances of abuse. And not to mention, the research doesn't support the danger. In fact, this is just one of many studies, but this was a large-scale epidemiological study that was done in the US, where they looked at, people who had used psychedelics and their mental health, and found that there was no connection between, poor mental health and psychedelics, as you might expect to see with other substances that are truly dangerous. And in fact, it seemed like maybe the people taking the psychedelics might actually even be a little bit better off. So, and we know that psychedelics are associated with reductions in so many of these psychiatric symptoms, such as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and so forth. So, and in fact, in this study, they even found that people taking psychedelics were less likely to require inpatient psychiatric treatment. Okay, next slide. That being said, there are risks with psychedelics. Do have some risks. For one, the research that's been done has been with some fairly homogeneous populations, and we need to expand the research to include a lot more diversity, different populations, not even just even beyond race and ethnicity as well, but research studies, they tend to study very narrow, homogeneous types of conditions. In the real world, we know that mental health is very messy. And so a lot more research is needed there to establish that not just the substances, but the techniques and the therapies and the way they're presented and the way that we're using them are culturally appropriate and acceptable for different groups. And we also know that the judgment of users is impaired while under the influence, and people are vulnerable. And so, and so there's safety issues around that, and this is something we have to think of always as we are doing as psychedelic assisted therapists, is, keeping people safe while they're having their psychedelic experience. And then also these substances can bring forth challenging experiences. Some people have, traumatic memories come up, the memories that they've really maybe not paid a lot of attention to or tried to suppress. But there it is in front of you. That can be very distressing. Or they may have sudden insights and realizations about things in their lives. Maybe they're good things that need to change, but as we know, any kind of change can be stressful, it can be painful, it can be difficult to to face. And so, and again, this is why I think it is so important that mental health professionals have a big role in psychedelics as people increasingly use them for these purposes. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned psychedelic assisted therapy. You may be wondering, what is that? What does that look like? So most of the models that we use for psychedelic therapy have these three components. First, what we call preparation, and that's getting the person ready for the psychedelic experience. Because if people go into the psychedelic experience afraid, not knowing what's going to happen, feeling like, oh my gosh, like I've taken the substance and now I'm dying, that could make it hard for them to get the most benefit from their experience. And so the more we think a lot of preparation is really an important piece of this, because we find the more open and accepting people are to the psychedelic experience, the more benefit they will get from it. Then we have the actual dosing session, and generally that would be a longer session where the therapist would be present, supporting the person through their journey. Some models have two therapists. So the model, the MAPS MDMA model, that type of therapy, there's always two therapists. So, if one needs a break or needs to go to the restroom or whatever, there's always a therapist there. We do ketamine assisted therapy at my clinic in Connecticut. We use two therapist model as well. And there's a lot of, I think, good reasons for doing two therapists for psychedelic therapy. Won't get into all of that today, but people often have two therapists for that. And then there's the integration. And so that's the next day, right? So after you've had all of the rainbows and smoke and demons and everything come out, you're like, what the heck do I do with that, right? And so that's where the therapist can kind of help the person make sense of some of the things that have come up, and which isn't to say people can't make sense of things on their own. They often do. And frankly, that's generally how maybe it's done in some in some cultures, you maybe don't talk about your experience. You just sort of process it on your own. But I think here in the West, like, we kind of need a therapist because we're not used to doing that. And it can be heavy stuff. And so that's what the integration is about, sort of making sense of what came up and then what are you going to do with it, right? So, okay, next slide, please. Now, you may be wondering, is there a market for psychedelic therapists? Yes, there are actually, there are jobs for psychedelic therapists, even though psychedelics are not yet legal. They're always looking for well-trained therapists for research studies involving psychedelics, and then also ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. Even though I mentioned most of the clinics are infusion clinics, more and more clinics are starting to offer the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, partially because a lot of these infusion clients are asking for it. So that's increasing. Also, there's a need to be able to serve people who've used psychedelics or have used other practices to obtain non-ordinary states of consciousness, right? So let's say someone's heard that psychedelics can be useful for mental health. They find some mushrooms, they take them at home, they have all this stuff happen. And then now they're like, okay, now I really need to talk to someone. So they may call a therapist, or they may talk to their therapist if they already have one and say, I need some integration help. And that's something that all of us as clinicians will probably encounter, especially as these substances become more popular. Also, there's a need for counselors and guides for people who are involved in religious practices that involve the legal use of entheogens, such as the Santo Daime Church. And then finally, we need researchers to do this work. The research dollars are literally pouring in, and there's research opportunities in psychology, in medicine, neuroscience, anthropology, and other related disciplines. So these are all different areas where people might require expertise in psychedelics. Okay, next slide. So for those of you who are mental health professionals, again, this is just not just a psychiatry thing, even though most of those centers I showed you at the beginning are in medical centers or psychiatry. But again, there's a huge role for therapists, for psychotherapists and counselors and psychologists, because we have all these substances here on the left, and then they're being tested for all these disorders here in the middle of the screen. These are all things that we deal with. And they're using these therapies in conjunction. Some of these are empirically supported therapies that we've been trained in. And so we know these therapies better than any of those other folks, right? And so we need to have a front row seat as these therapies are being rolled out and working with clients who are using psychedelics. So yeah, so that takes us to our next slide on education and training in psychedelic therapies, right? Because you are going to need education and training to do all that stuff. So, and for those of you who are licensed, you probably know that you are expected to work within your scope of practice. And where do you get the training that you need to do this work? There are actually a lot of people who do this work underground, varying amounts of training. It's a wild, wild west out there. There's lots of underground guides that do a wonderful job. There's others not so good. There's no accountability, no standards, no way to know who's good and who's not. And so these are things we need to think about, establishing some of these structures that are needed to ensure safety and help improve access. And so the guiding principle here: maximize therapeutic and spiritual benefits while reducing potential for harm. And a group of us created a committee here, here in Canada to look at these issues and make some recommendations. And some of the things, and those are the members of the committee on the right there. And these included recommendations around education, what should be included in the education that psychedelic therapists are being trained in. How do we determine who's qualified to do the work? What are the ethics? And then how do we roll this out on a national scale? And these are the key pieces of that. So you can go to the next slide now. So the first piece, education and training. we are advocating for the development of training programs at reputable degree granting institutions. There are many training programs out there. Most of them are not at accredited institutions. Some of them are still good. Some of them are fly by night. And again, there's no standards. So, so we think that the best place for education and training is the places that have already been developed for education and training, which are, universities and colleges. So, so that's some of the work we're doing to bring this forward. The training needs to include medical, therapeutic, spiritual, ritual uses of entheogens and psychedelics cross-culturally throughout human history. Also understanding things like consciousness, like what is consciousness, right? Mysticism, mental health, human well-being, development, culturally sensitive approaches, and actual hands-on experiential practice in preparing, supervising, guiding, and integrating work and treatment sessions. Next slide. So one of the things that we've proposed is a 2-tier practitioner credentialing process where you have maybe 2 therapists, a primary facilitator and a secondary facilitator. Primary facilitator would need to be licensed. The second one would work under the supervision of the primary facilitator. And this would be a good opportunity where people could take that second seat and get trained, or that could be a student. Other things to consider, we're not proposing that counselors and psychotherapists give medicines. Prescribers would be the ones to do that, and they would have to be trained and licensed in their appropriate jurisdictional practice. And people would need to work to maintain their credentials, and have and be working in a legitimate setting. All right, next slide. And ethics are incredibly important. This work opens up a whole new box of questions, of things that people hadn't really been thinking about in terms of what ethical work is with a client who is in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So there are a lot of things to learn about what are healthy boundaries and guidelines, and people may be afraid during their psychedelic experience. They may want someone to hold their hand. Maybe you wouldn't normally hold a client's hand when you're doing therapy, but in a psychedelic journey, would that be different, right? And also given how very vulnerable people are, the extra care that needs to be taken with them. And then also just, other things like respect, recognizing people's rights, being confident, confidentiality, integrity, and so forth. So all of these pieces need to be included in our ethics. And there's actually been a number of papers that have come out on, ethical recommendations, like MAPS came out with ethical guidelines for their MDMA therapists. There's ethical guidelines for ketamine therapists. We put ethical guidelines in this paper that we wrote with the task force. And I do think that these ethical guidelines are starting to converge, but right now there's not like one set of standard accepted ethics. Okay, so all of that, and I guess next slide, I'll hand the mic back to Anne.
Did you want to specifically address this, or this was included in what you were saying?
Oh, yeah. Just wasn't sure whose turn it was yet. Yeah, so there are still issues, right? So this isn't a panacea. We still have, obviously, research we need to do with marginalized groups. It's that article on the side there, Black Americans being left out of psychedelic research. I interviewed for that article with Tonic. I said everyone, all different ethnic and racial groups are being left out. For some reason, they just focused on Black Americans, which is fine. I'm Black, it's important. And also recognizing that a lot of what we do and how we're doing it has been appropriated from Indigenous knowledge. And sometimes at great personal cost to the Indigenous people who shared that knowledge. And so that's a piece we have to reckon with. Again, no standards. We have no standards of training for practitioners. And sadly, because clients are so vulnerable when they're under the influence of psychedelics, many are taken advantage of. There's been a problem with sexual abuse in some retreats and even some therapists. And we know sexual abuse is already a problem with therapists, even without psychedelics. So think about how bad that is when you add psychedelics. And so again, back to ethical standards being so important. All right. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Monica. You have the lion's share here. I'm just going to say a few words about what we've been up to at the University of Ottawa in the last couple of years. Clearly, there's much to be done. There's a lot of pieces that need to go into programming and training skilled therapists. And so we just wanted to give you an overview. I'll speak specifically to the ones that relate to spirituality, and then Monica, again, you'll speak to the ones that are housed in psychology. So these are, again, a kind of overview right here on this slide of the programs that we've been involved in. These are graduate micro programs here. I should have included that. Graduate micro programs. The first one was created nearly 3 years back now. It's 2.5 years ago, spring, just the start of COVID. We launched the Psychedelics and Spirituality Graduate Micro Program in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. So this is a 3-course, 9-credit graduate program that is just looking at the history, it's looking at harm reduction. Well, I'll show you in more detail what those courses are. But it could be for therapists, but it's mainly looking at it from a religious studies or anthropological, historical perspective. There's no practical component in it. So we have a series of micro programs. We're going to look at each of them in turn, and graduate diploma as well as a master's degree that we're hoping will launch in the fall. So just quickly, this is the micro program I was mentioning to you, housed in classics and religious studies, my own department. And these are the 3 courses that are required in that program. Fascinating courses, again, no experiential component. It's an academic program. So it does attract psychology students, but it's also attracting, as I'm saying, religious studies students or history students or philosophy students. I'll go on to the next in the interest of time. We're building and hoping again to launch a program in the fall at the same time that the master's program will be launched. And this will be a graduate micro program it's actually going to be psychedelic assisted spiritual care, counseling and psychotherapy is the title of the program. And we're doing this with St. Paul University here in Ottawa. St. Paul's University already has a theological college. It has a master's program in counseling and spirituality, a very popular one, a very good one. They've become very interested in this as well. So we're going to launch this particular program together, a joint inter-university program. And you can see the courses, these are the required courses for that. There will be a practicum, there will be field work, again, sort of courses on comparative mysticism, non-ordinary states of consciousness, better understanding those. And St. Paul's will contribute at least 1 course. I think we're already back to you, Monica.
Right. Also through the School of Psychology, we are going to be offering the Master's in Psychedelic Consciousness Studies, and alluded to that. It's a 1-year online master's program, and it includes actually that basically everything that's in the micro program that's running now in psychedelics and spirituality, plus a number of other courses that that could make up. Actually, there's another micro program. I'll get to that as well in psychology. But it includes the 3 classes plus psychedelic psychotherapies for mental health, plus field work in traditional uses of psychedelic, and which is an opportunity for people to have experiential learning in psychedelics, as well as applied, what we're calling applied research practicum, is actually sort of like your clinical experience, where you actually get to do work as a psychedelic therapist under supervision of an experienced clinician, and 3 electives from a wide variety of related courses. So that, so you do all that and you're going to get a master's degree in psychedelics and consciousness studies. How cool is that? We have 3 tracks, one for, mental health professionals, one for spiritual and religious interest, and one is sort of more pure research. All right, next slide. And this is the new micro program that we're offering in the School of Psychology. You'll recognize some of those courses. We've got the psychedelic psychotherapies and mental health, brand new graduate course, and teaching it this semester. It's been so much fun, and I really kind of pinch myself because honestly, I never thought I'd be teaching a graduate class in psychedelic psychotherapies. That's actually in the catalog, not a special seminar. And then 2 other classes, one focused on drugs and psychopharmacology from these selection, and one focused on the brain and mind, something in consciousness or neuroscience, or even one of the courses in the other micro program if you didn't take it already. All right, and then what's next? Yeah, and then we also have a graduate diploma, which is basically which is going to really be for clinicians who maybe they don't want a whole master's degree, but they want something that will teach them how to be a psychedelic therapist. And we have this graduate diploma, which is sort of a subset of the master's program. Basically the stuff I showed you minus the electives. So, yeah. All right. Go ahead, Anne.
I didn't know if you wanted to speak on this. So both the master's program and I think also the graduate diploma that you've just mentioned, Monica, certainly also the graduate micro program in psychedelic assisted spiritual care, counseling and psychotherapy with St. Paul's will have a fieldwork component for our students. And so the University of Ottawa is now busily trying to make connections with potential field sites, both in Canada. We had mentioned already these entheogenic churches. For instance, there's a Santo Daime church in Montreal, where ayahuasca is the sacrament for that community and where it's illegal, right? They have the legal protection to serve that. There may be an opportunity, there will be an opportunity for students to participate if they're interested in participating. We can't force students to drink ayahuasca, right? But it would be an opportunity for those who want that experience to participate there. There's another opportunity with psilocybin in Jamaica, because as it turns out, psilocybin is not illegal in Jamaica. It's kind of just under the radar. It's neither legal nor illegal. It's just never been legalized. So it's they're organizing retreats now, really remarkable looking retreats. I'm looking forward to visiting and checking that out with Monica, but we're hoping that will be a kind of a core field site for our students. So it would be with psilocybin. They do a really interesting kind of model where a group of 12 together have a strong, powerful experience with psilocybin, with magic mushrooms, in the presence of clinical psychologists and a medical doctor. And in their next session, I think it's their next or their third session, 6 of them take the psilocybin and 6 do not, and they sit as guides. So it's a sort of a one-on-one relationship, or one is in the presence of one who was having that experience. So it's a really powerful training. And then the following day or 2 days later, they take that, they have their third experience with psilocybin, and their partner then. I don't know if it's something that I'm doing on my screen or, right, so we wanted to mention this because this is going to be built into our programs for our graduate students, but we're also, creating relationships that can be open for health and spiritual care professionals who are not in that program, who might be interested in just participating in an experiential trip. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else on that, Monica.
Yeah, I mean, just this year I organized 3 retreats in Ecuador for clinicians, one in May specifically for clinicians, to be able to have experiences and learn how these substances work, combined with the workshop that I gave on self-care. And we had the facilitator, who was the healer, was also an MD. So we did 3 of those this year, and in the coming year, we're looking to hopefully do some of these in Jamaica. So, so I'm really excited about that, and they are fantastic learning opportunities, I find, for clinicians. Yeah, and so next slide. So in summary, psychedelics are not new, but integrating them into our current Western paradigms is new. And with any new technology, there's going to be growing pains. It does seem very clear that psychedelics can be beneficial for mental health and well-being. There is a big push right now from the public to make these available. But there are many concerns and caveats, as we pointed out, they're not a panacea. You still got to do the work, but you know, and we're still like really sort of figuring out how we're going to, you know, ensure again safety and training and so forth. The research is very, very promising, and yet even more is needed to unravel the mysteries of psychedelics. So next slide. And there's our contact information. So, and we'll take questions now.
So thank you so much, and Monica, this has been fascinating. I know I have quite a few questions myself. I would just ask people who have questions, if you can just raise your hand using the button at with Zoom. There were a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just go to them. So first of all, there was one of the participants asked if we could share the slides. And I don't know if this would be agreeable with you. If so, we would email that to the participants later on. Another question that came is, will the information on the programs covered be circulated? So I think that could be something to manage, Monica or Anne.
Yeah, I mean, we have actually a website that has details on all the programs except the master's program. We weren't allowed to put that information up yet until it goes through one more, I think, round of approvals. But we're happy to make that information available, and we can create a version of the slides we can share with you. So.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Maybe we could post these slides on that website. I'm not sure if that would be a good way of doing it, but would that make sense? Or
we will talk about it later.
Okay.
Yeah. We could definitely share this with the participants here. And then we have a question from Valerie.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. What a fascinating presentation. I loved it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one, but yeah, first I want to thank you for sharing all of that. And then my question is specific to PTSD treatment. So Dr. Williams, I think you mentioned that you provide prolonged exposure, and I'm also trained in PE for PTSD. I've read, not recently, but a little bit of research around the use of psychedelics to help support treatment. My question is, I'm wondering if you're aware of any research, either specifically or at an aggregate level, that would support, like basically that would indicate that there's evidence that use of psychedelics can become safety behaviors. And I think my question is, you know, so often we see clients who end up using different substances really to help them cope in the short term. And so I haven't seen that in the research, the little research that I'm aware of involving psychedelic substances, but I wondered if you were aware.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, we do see, you know, I work with anxiety related conditions. So certainly we see our clients, you know, reaching for the benzos every time they feel anxious or triggered or so forth. And certainly that happens for other substances too, like alcohol or heroin or other substances. Psychedelics, not so much, which isn't to say it doesn't occur. I'm sure for some people it does, but for the most part, people are not, you know, reaching for their psychedelic when they feel anxious, because first of all, that's going to be like several hours. You're going to be out of it if you take the psychedelic. You can't do that every day, or you'll be out of it every day. But not to mention, it's unpredictable. So sometimes, again, you're not having a good experience, or we call these challenging experiences, because the idea is that you learn something even when it's challenging, but it's not always a good experience. And so, so people aren't generally taking the psychedelics as a way to escape. There's much easier. There's drugs that work much better for that than psychedelics. I'll just say.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have another question here in the chat. So Catherine is asking, does the same research participants who take psychedelics also the same? Sorry, Catherine, I'm not super clear about the question. I guess you're asking, are those the same? Go ahead, Catherine. I see you're on, so you can.
Yeah. So would they be the same participants who have tried psychotherapy alone without the psychedelics? I'm just wondering how the effectiveness is measured. So if the results could be like, how the psychedelics, the effectiveness of the psychedelics is separated since psychotherapy goes alongside with it. So how do we know the psychotherapy is what is effective? Do you know what I'm asking now? Like how that's separate? And one of the reasons why I'm asking is because I also noted that 32% of participants in the placebo group no longer had a PTSD diagnosis after 3 sessions. So I'm just wondering how all of that is kind of separated and measured.
Yep. That's a good question, right? So if we're talking, for example, about the MDMA studies for PTSD, you're absolutely, a lot of people got better. There's 2 conditions. There's one where you get the psychedelic, another you get a placebo. And a number of people improve with the placebo, but you got to remember the placebo group, they still got like a bazillion hours of therapy too. So, so we know that the therapy by itself is helpful, but remember, these were all people who are treatment resistant. So they had all tried several other things before and they weren't useful, which is why I think you don't even see a bigger response to the placebo, which is therapy. But also for this study, they do a crossover design too. So once you've had, like if you got the MDMA, like if you didn't get the MDMA, if you got the placebo, then you come back 6 months, a year later and get the treatment again with the MDMA. So that they even also have data on how the people did who got only therapy and then got the therapy plus the psychedelic. So it's a very carefully controlled study to make sure that the different effects were isolated.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
So another question that came in the chat came anonymously. The person was asking if psychedelics are available through the Royal Ottawa Hospital, and if they do, the psychedelics treatments that would be, and if it does, how can therapists or workers refer clients to such practices? And there was another question that came actually before the presentation. I would incorporate into this question as well. Someone else had asked if there's a place, or is there a way where we can look for therapists who practice that already? So is there some sort of an index of some sort where we can search that and refer clients?
Yes. So because these substances are not yet legal, there's not any place where you can go and get psychedelic therapy in Canada for the most part. Now you can get ketamine assisted therapy, but even that is there. Even for that, there aren't really a lot of places in Canada where you can get ketamine assisted therapy. So I mean, I know there's a clinic, in Montreal, but and then there's some in Toronto, but they're not widely accessible. Yeah. So.
I guess I just would like to mention the individual cases that we do hear about now between an individual physician with their patient. They can apply for that special access program to the federal government, but it's very much a one-on-one. And thus far, most of those permissions have been for individuals at the end of life. So they're using particularly psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety. But again, it's so the patient has to be in that kind of critical state, and then the doctor will apply, and it can take several weeks, and it's a very cumbersome process. But that's all we have right now.
Thank you. It's actually really good to know that the option is available. I have a question myself. So there is a practice of a special breathing that is supposed to induce psychedelic responses in the body. And I'm not sure how much research is there about it. And is there any involvement of such practices within current research? Because if similar responses can be achieved, without using substances. Perhaps this is an alternative solution for many people.
Yes.
You want to take that, Monica? I mean, I would just, I'll say a word and then I'll let you answer it because you'll have more information on it. Certainly there is this holotropic breath work that's quite widespread now. There's many people who offer these courses in holotropic breath work. Stanislav Grof, who was a leader in psychedelic research, actually developed this holotropic breathwork as an alternative. I've heard such mixed reviews. I haven't myself had the experience of the breathwork. I've heard mixed reviews. Some say absolutely powerful experiences, and others have said not at all comparable. So I don't know, but we're thinking of offering that as part of the program for people who are coming into the program, especially if these substances are illegal. Even if they're not, can you force somebody to drink ayahuasca or take psilocybin? I don't think so. So there ought to be alternative kinds of practices that they could do. And then there's the argument that's often made that there are some people who have had powerful spiritual experiences. And I'm thinking here for the therapist, not so much for the patient, but for the therapist. My workings with the theologians over at St. Paul's University have taught me, I may not be interested in psychedelics at all, but I don't need them, that I've had through my own spiritual practices, a belief in this kind of transcendent state, or something transpersonal. I believe that there's something greater, and that's enough. That might be enough. So I think in terms of who's coming into the program to be a therapist, the ideal is that somebody would have had an experience of a non-ordinary state of consciousness. Does that have to be through a psychedelic? I don't think so. And certainly the holotropic breath work would be an interesting alternative. Monica, I don't know if you have something to add on that.
Yeah, I think, holotropic breathwork, people do sort of put that out there as a way to, again, achieve this non-ordinary state of consciousness. It takes a while, a lot of doing. You're basically hyperventilating for a couple hours until you hallucinate, the gist of it, with somebody there supporting you. With maybe music and eye shades and so forth. I've done it a few times. It's, and again, like Anne said, it's kind of different for different people. So for me, I kind of maybe had it kind of felt like I was dreaming, or maybe in that state, right when you're about to wake up when you're sleeping. And I found it interesting, but not particularly useful in the same way as maybe a psychedelic assisted therapy experience would be. But again, that's going to be very individual. And I do think we need alternatives for people because, some people have medical conditions. They can't take a psychedelic, a drug, right? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Marwan has a question.
Thank you. And thank you for this very interesting presentation. Myself, as I combine theology as my educational background and psychotherapy as a counselor, social worker, my question is for should I call them the Abrahamic religion, okay? How psychedelic assisted therapies are really accepted, and especially that you have mentioned theologian at St. Paul, for instance. Do they, the authorities in these religions, do they have a saying about this from a religious or theological perspective, not therapeutical, I mean? And I saw during the presentation a photo of Santa Teresa de Avila, who is actually a mystic, actually. So the boundaries between the mystic experience and the psychedelic effect as well.
It's such a great question, and I'm actually trying to write an article with a theologian friend, colleague at St. Paul's, and we've been trying for a year now to write an article on this. I've had some of the best and most heated debates and discussions around this very topic. So there are a number of theologians who are very interested in psychedelics and see them as, it's almost as if it's an intention. What I am seeing from those within the Abrahamic traditions in particular, and again, that was the language that you were using, and then those traditions that understand God as transcendent, And that if there's going to be a mystical experience, it's going to be God's decision, right? It's not that I'm going to meet God at Wednesday at 3 p.m. in a clinic, as though I can have, that I can actually determine that. There's a kind of chutzpah, there's a kind of arrogance in that, or that's the sort of pushback. So there are some who reject that and say that it's not a sacrament and that it's not the same as a classical mystical experience. And I kind of alluded to that in the presentation. There's a lot of debate around it. So there are theologians on both sides, and they're even at St. Paul's, that some are very interested. They do not see it as an entheogen. They do not see it as the plant itself being divine, those from within the Abrahamic traditions, as far as I can see, but they see it as a kind of a intention to open to God. And so they're willing to support it, or they might prefer to see it as a medicine, right? That is a purely not a sacrament. And I've heard that argument as well. Strongly supportive. In fact, we have a theologian at St. Paul's strongly supportive of this, but not as a sacrament, wants to see it as a medicine. So embracing the biomedical here. So it's all over the place. Again, a really fascinating discussion. Some traditions are more open, and I don't mean that in a positive or negative way, just more open to it than others. Some traditions are a bit more closed towards it. Yeah.
Thank you. And if may I as well, it's very interesting how you call it a sacrament, because actually, if we look at the elements, comparing a sacrament to the psychedelic process, the elements are existing on both sides, actually. Mm-hmm. So there is something in a sacrament that is administered, given to someone, concrete and tangible. So the spiritual effect is there. So anyway, it's very interesting, and thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah.
I know there was another hand that was risen before. Catherine, if you have a quick question, we want to finish in a few minutes, but go ahead, please.
Just piggybacking off of that, because actually that's where my mind was going. I was wondering if there were specific religious denominations that there's been a backlash around it. And one of the reasons why I was thinking about this for myself is I work for an organization, a counseling agency that is funded by Catholic Charities, which is are one of our main funders, actually, that provide funding for our counseling for our community. And I'm just wondering about, I haven't done any research on this, so I'm not sure if there are religious denominations that are, how they view this. I'm wondering, probably Anne, you could speak to that.
The jury is out, actually. We just don't yet have that information. So mine is very anecdotal in my workings with colleagues at St. Paul's University. There's a lot of interest, and they've embraced this program. In fact, they see a value in it. So we have now this program, as I was mentioning, in psychedelic assisted spiritual care. They see a value in it. Whether or not they will see this as sacred, right? That's where the challenge comes in. So I think they may not. Right, they may not. Some are very willing to embrace it. Again, that language of sacrament is odious to some, and saying that that's a kind of a Christian language, like a sacrament language should not be used in another context. But others then say, but it is. And if indigenous traditions often talk about the plants as being sacraments, certainly they do in the Santo Daime. It's all over the place. There's no canon yet around these issues, and I do think that. It will be conservative. The Catholic Church will take a conservative position, I would imagine, and embrace it as a medicine is what my guess would be. But not condemning the practice, not condemning just not defining it as mysticism, not defining it as an access to.
Yeah, seeing it again, as you said earlier, seeing it as medicine, not as sacred. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at this point it would be nearly impossible for any large Christian group to come out against psychedelics as bad or evil. There just isn't any. I don't think there's support for that.
No.
Okay, thanks very much.
I would actually add from my own perspective that having heard Marwan's question and Catherine's question and your answers, I now have a different way to think about the story of Jonah. He was sitting in the Bible. He was sitting under the castor oil tree, which has some psychedelic effects to its fruit, and probably not a coincidence that he was under that tree and not just an olive tree or any other fig tree or whatever. So maybe it's the way for those religions to tell us something in a different way.
And
In
there's,
any
there's
case,
scholarship, beginning scholarship on this. There's some fascinating stuff. If you're interested, I can send you the links.
I would love to. It is 7 p.m. I want to thank so much Anne and Monica for taking the time to present today, and for Tatiana to help us facilitate that. And Monica, if there's any final words you want to share with the crowd.
Oh, yeah, no, it was just a wonderful being here, and it's so and heartwarming to see so much interest. You know, and yeah, just I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
I would echo that. It's been a joy, and if anybody is interested, you know, in the field trips, by all means, reach out to us, or about any other aspect of the programs that we're doing. So thanks again for having us.
So thank you to all the participants and for all who shared their questions and thoughts. We will have this recording available on our website, and we will share more information from Anne and Monica in a few days. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.